You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Dwight Chapin. You may have heard his name. He has one of the most interesting political careers from a staff perspective, and we love staffers here at the Veteran Strategies or at the Leaders and Legends podcast because that's what we did. Dwight Chapin served as the Secretary and Deputy Assistant to President Richard Nixon from 1969 to 1973. He also worked for him in the 1962 campaign as a field man. And it was there at the campaign, I believe, that he met a fellow named H.R. Haldeman, and he went to go work for him at the J. Walter Thompson Public Relations Company. Chapin was part of Nixon's presidential campaign from 67 to 68, then served in the White House. Time magazine once described him as, quote, young, athletic, religious, handsome, clean-cut, bright, ambitious, and tough. I should also add Mr. Chapin is a proud alumnus of the University of Southern California and has already accused Notre Dame of cheating in the pre-interview part of this discussion. Mr. Chapin, thank you very much for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Terrific, Robert. It's great to be with you.
You know, there's so many books about Nixon, about Watergate, about politics in the 60s and 70s. What made you decide to add your talents to the list?
Well, I was renovating, actually in charge of a group renovating the Nixon Library out in Yorba Linda, California. And in doing that and pulling everything together, I started realizing that so many people looked at Nixon and there were two buckets. One bucket was Watergate, the other bucket was China. And it didn't begin to cover the whole breadth of Nixon's career and what he had accomplished and what kind of man he was. And so I thought, hey, you know, I probably have an obligation to history to at least put down as much as I can on the man I knew and present this guy as I knew him. So that's kind of what led to the book first having the seed of an idea.
Dwight Chapin's book is called The President's Man, which I have to say is just a brilliant, brilliant title. Whose idea was it?
That was the publisher's idea. Robert, I thought it was a little ego-centered when they called and said, you know, we want to call the book, put the title The President's Man on there. I thought, yeah, that's not right. You know, I mean, Haldeman or Ehrlichman or Kissinger, any number of different people, George Shultz. I mean, there were a lot of men around the president. But then the publisher said, no, Dwight, we're going to modify this. And we're going to have The President's Man. And then it's going to say the Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. So that started to modify it. And then they also came up with a picture that they wanted to use, which clearly established me in more of an aide-like role, showing him a document. So eventually I was happy with the choice. And now I got to say I'm delighted with the title because the book's successful and everybody seems to be able to remember it.
Well, it's clearly a play on All the President's Men that was written by Woodward and Bernstein. Did the fact that maybe the title of your book could be associated with the title of that book give you pause?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I do think that it was a play off of that. There's no question. It was conceived, as I said, by the publisher, but it didn't give me any pause, no.
When do you think that you caught the political bug as a kid? You grew up, you were a teenager and a young man in some very, very important historical times. And one of the questions I like to ask folks like you when they come on the podcast is, when did you kind of get the itch to be in politics or be interested in candidates?
Yes, I was in high school. I had been boys president and I was student body president. So I was kind of inclined toward, being up front or out front or however you want to put it. But I remember that there was a mayor of Los Angeles, a man running for it by the name of Sam Yorty. And he was an independent. He was a Democrat, but the mayorship was an independent job. And I distributed bumper stickers and went door to door in our neighborhood. And I probably was maybe 14, 15 years old. So that to me, that was my first kind of little entree into elective politics. So that I would pick that benchmark.
Were you someone who was influenced by the administration of Dwight Eisenhower? I was born in 1967. When people say, what made you a Republican? My first answer usually is, I grew up in the Reagan years. And so it was easy to be a Republican. Is that something that you felt too? Yes,
very definitely. And it was easy to be an Eisenhower Republican. And of course, Nixon was his vice president. So, there's that tie. Plus, the congressional district in California that we lived in, that is the congressional district that Nixon represented when he first went to Congress. So there was that tie also.
In 1946 when he won his first?
Yes.
And then in 1950, he wins the Senate.
In 1952, he runs with Eisenhower.
Did President Nixon ever talk to you about any of those campaigns, especially the pink underwear campaign against Helen Douglas and for the Senate in 1950?
Helen Kagan Douglas. He did not talk to me about that, no. But I'm very familiar with the story, and I'm very familiar with his other campaigns. His first one was against a man by the name of Jerry Voorhees, and Jerry Voorhees had been voted the most popular congressman by the media in Washington, D.C., and Nixon goes out and he beats him. So right out of the box, he beats a Democrat that was one of the favorites of the media. That you could pinpoint that as maybe the start of the battle between Nixon and the media.
Nixon, and we're going to get to so much to talk about, but there are some things that I want to make sure that you get a chance to weigh in on. I always felt that in my reading of Nixon, that the Watergate thing for him was kind of like, why me? Like, everyone does all this kind of stuff. And you do a great job in your book of talking about Dick Tuck, who was the Democrat dirty trickster for years and years and years, whose reputation was so accepted that when Pat Buchanan, because I watched Pat Buchanan's testimony in front of the Watergate committee, he mentions it and Sam Ervin starts laughing. Like, they all knew, like, this is just part of the game. And I always thought that Nixon got a bad rap for being such a ruthless campaigner, with 46 and 1950 being the two big examples. I guess you could throw in Alger Hiss as well. But do you think that reputation assigned to Nixon is fair or unfair?
Unfair. And I think also, Robert, you've got to build into that General Eisenhower was up on another level, and you had his vice president, Nixon, and all of the political work that needed to be done and the attacking, of the Democrats and so forth, all fell to Nixon. So Nixon's carrying the political baggage all through the Eisenhower years. And you end up with him, therefore, getting the Herblock and the Conrad type cartoons, very brutal cartoons and so forth. So Nixon took a hell of a beating through that whole period.
But isn't it fair to say that nothing Nixon did, let's say prior to big Watergate, that nothing he did was out of the ordinary or that would be found as shocking? I mean, am I remembering correctly that the Kennedy family brought in Franklin Roosevelt Jr. to basically accuse Hubert Humphrey of being a draft dodger in the West Virginia primary in 1960? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that went on.
Yes, it's not a gentle business. Politics is, as somebody said, not beanbag. So President Nixon was, he was in the middle of a lot of different political brawls, but to my knowledge, nothing illegal, nothing highly different than what was going on with our opposition.
When you were younger, did you watch live or did you watch or listen to the Checkers speech by Senator Nixon?
Too little. I do not remember that speech. I've seen it a number of times, and we included it into the Nixon Library when we renovated the library. We have it. Visitors actually see the speech, and we put it into a display that gives a lot of the context in which it happened. But I don't remember the speech from that night, no.
President Nixon, or Richard Nixon, served 2 terms as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, then ran for the presidency himself in 1960 against John F. Kennedy, famous or infamously lost by a razor-thin, highly disputed margin. Did President Nixon ever talk to you about that race?
No, we never discussed that race.
In 1962, Nixon decides to run for governor of California, and he loses relatively badly, especially coming after the Cuban Missile Crisis that was going on at the same time. No one could have predicted, I would say, that Richard Nixon would be elected president of the United States after losing in 1962 to Pat Brown. Is it fair to say that was your political baptism, Dwight?
Yes. In 1962, I was hired to be a field man, and I was in charge of the San Fernando Valley of LA County, Ventura County, and Santa Barbara County. I was a college student, but my responsibility was to go around in those counties and work with basically housewives at the time. I mean, women at that juncture really weren't into the job market like they are today. And we used housewives as volunteers to establish little community campaign headquarters where they would have precinct sheets. This is the days of really the grassroots politics. And it had been Bob Haldeman that hired me to become a field man. Bob Haldeman later becoming Nixon's chief of staff later, but he was the campaign manager in 1962. I'm one of the few people that you could talk to who actually thought Nixon was going to win in 1962. I was so naive. I mean, I'm a kid, I'm 21 years old, and when Nixon lost to Pat Brown in that campaign, I mean, I drove all over LA the next day, just kind of sobbing, and so my world had fallen apart. I do want to make the point, though, Robert, that the morning after the election, so it would have been Wednesday morning, when Nixon came downstairs into the ballroom of the Beverly Hilton Hotel, I was standing about 8 feet from it at one of the most remarkable things that I had ever seen, where he is talking to the media and he says, "Gentlemen, I want you to know that you're not going to have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. This is my last press conference." And with that, he marched out of the ballroom, and ABC ran a show. Howard K. Smith was the anchor, and they even had Alger Hiss, Nixon's arch enemy, on that show, and it was called "The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon." That was the end. That was the end of his political career right there.
Someone we would love to have on the Leaders and Legends podcast to talk about these various things is your friend. I think he's your friend. That's what I got from the book, Patrick Buchanan.
Pat's one of my dear friends. Pat's one of my closest friends.
He's a terrific writer, and I'm going to ask you about both his books, but about this kind of time period. But let me ask you about his book, The Greatest Comeback.
Yes.
About Nixon's rise from 1962 and that press conference, where I'm sure he got a ton of personal delight and satisfaction, but it clearly hurt him, and the media didn't miss an opportunity to step on him when they could. If I had told you in 1962 Nixon would be elected president in 1968, you would have said?
I would have said, nope, no way, it's all over. But I wouldn't have said that in 1963. And the difference is, in 1962, in November, he loses. But when we go ahead and start into the first part of 1973, I had been invited by Bob Haldeman to join him at J. Walter Thompson Advertising. So I would go after class at USC. I would go to the advertising agency and work in the afternoons part-time. So, and Bob starts educating me more about Nixon, who has now gone from California back to New York City, where he is now a lawyer. He's the lead name on a big law firm, Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. And Bob starts flying east, attending strategy meetings with Nixon, who in 1973 is starting to figure out how to have his comeback. And lo and behold, in this period, Jack Kennedy gets assassinated, and Nixon is faced with an immediate decision as to whether or not to challenge Barry Goldwater, who is the conservative Republican candidate that is really ahead in all the polls and so forth, or whether Nixon should wait and let Goldwater go up against LBJ, wait for that to happen, and then go forward for the presidency in 1968. And Nixon makes the strategic decision, a very important one, to forego trying to go up against Goldwater and win the nomination from the Republicans. And what Nixon does is he goes all over America and he campaigns his tail off on behalf of Barry Goldwater. And that really ingratiates him with the conservative movement in the country.
He did the same thing in 1966, which ironically turned out to be a strong Republican year, but he campaigned across the country in 66 for Republican candidates. And really the 64-66 1-2 punch sets him up for 68. When did you start working for then candidate or ex-Vice President Nixon, who is going to be candidate Nixon, in the mid to late 60s all the way through his time in office?
Okay, so and a very important part of my story is that I moved to the East Coast in 1965. And when I got to the East Coast, I called Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods. That we're talking about New York City now, and I volunteered. And Rose said, "Okay, well, can you come down in the evening?" So around immediately after work, for 2 or 3 days a week, I would hop on the subway and I would go from Midtown New York down to Wall Street, where Nixon's law firm was, and I would volunteer. The person that was teaching me how to answer mail, because that was what they had me doing, but my tutor was Pat Nixon, Richard Nixon's wife. Later to be First Lady. She is the one teaching me how to respond to all these people that are writing these letters that we're getting. And we got literally hundreds of letters, because Nixon was in the news quite a lot. He was the logical frontrunner candidate for 1968 after Goldwater had lost in 64. And Nixon had a policy in his office throughout all the days that I ever knew him, that every letter was to be answered. Every piece of correspondence that came into him was to receive a dignified response. And so I was there handling this correspondence. And the important piece, Robert, is that not only was Mrs. Nixon teaching me how to do this, but she was sizing me up. And when you're working closely with a prominent family like that, the key factor becomes trust. And I think that she got to know me. She got to know about my wife, Susie, and our 2 little girls. She would ask me all kinds of questions, and I can't help but believe that she would pass that on to her husband. And the quality of the work that I was doing for them, and that was what seeded me in to become his personal aide, in my opinion. Mrs. Nixon was hugely responsible for that happening.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Dwight Chapin, author of The President's Man, the Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. When did you know that Nixon was going to run in 68? And how did you feel about being a part of what was clearly going to be a significant historic campaign?
Yes. Well, in 1966, as you have clearly pointed out, and it is very important, he went all over this country on behalf of congressmen and people in Senate races also. And I was an advance man in 66. I went out and set up events that he would appear at. That election was in November, obviously, of 66. On the 1st of December, Bob Haldeman visited from Southern California. And he said to me, "Dwight, I think you're going to have an opportunity to work in a presidential campaign. You're going to get a call from Rosemary Woods, and Mr. Nixon's going to want to talk to you." Well, sure enough, by the end of December, I forget the exact date, phone call came asking if I could come down to the law firm. I went down and I had this, the meeting was probably like 10 minutes in length. And he was never, Mr. Nixon was never really direct about it. He said, "I am kind of, thinking that this is going to be an interesting period of time. And we'll do a lot of," he assumed I was going to say yes. I don't know that he ever asked me, "Dwight, would you like to come and be my personal aide?" It just kind of, this conversation evolved. And what I remember most about it was not so much the conversation with him, but the one with my father. Because that night I called my dad in Southern California. I said, "Dad, I've got this opportunity here to work for Mr. Nixon, and he may be the next president. And Dad said, "Oh, I don't know about that." He said, politics, you never know. He says, you don't want to be burning all your bridges at the advertising agency. And of course, I could have cared less about the advertising agency. I was aboard. I jumped on this horse, and the Nixons had been nice to me. I'm into the group. Because of Haldeman. I've met all of these people. I know everything that's going on, in terms of the startup of the campaign, and so I was ready to roll.
How did Nixon treat you personally? There's so much that's been written about his personality and psychological profiles, and this is why he did this, and his paranoia is why he did that, and that sort of thing. But how was he to you? He was obviously, I think he would definitely be in the top. He would be on my Mount Rushmore of the most intelligent presidents, just in terms of pure intelligence. How did he treat you when it was just one-on-one? Was he, solicitous? Was he kind? Obviously, he was demanding. What was it like when it was just you and him?
It's a great question. I want to use the word comfortable. I don't know what it was. I've talked about this before. I think maybe my parents, my grandparents, Bob Haldeman for sure. I was taught early on to take responsibility. I can remember I fed the cattle. Went out. We lived on a farm in Kansas. And I'm 13, 14 years old, getting up at 4:30 in the morning, taking care of, 20 head of cattle. Not a lot of cattle, but a lot of responsibility for a young man that age. And I had the gift of a work ethic taught to me, and so I was reliable, and I followed instructions. And when I was told to do something, I did it. And I was taught not to complain. So when it came to working with Mr. Nixon, it was to me just like working for somebody else. The guy had been former vice president of the United States. By this time, have in mind that I've been going down to the law firm for for a couple of years, working on the court. So my comfort zone was really substantial, and I had an intuitiveness about what it was that he would want or how he would want things to work. And the main thing was that within the bubble of just the two of us moving around the country, and for months, it was just the two of us. In that little bubble of us going around the country, there were some rules. There are no surprises, keep everything, calm, almost a Quaker peace at the center type thing. We didn't need drama. We had enough drama just with news people and that kind of stuff. So we wanted to have an environment that was stable, and to make sure that he was on schedule. He, unlike, for example, Jack Kennedy, part of their psychology was to run 45 minutes to an hour late, with the idea that he was late because he was so popular and so forth. Nixon didn't buy into that. Nixon came from an efficiency point of view. If we're due there at 6:10, we'll be there at 6:10, and so forth. So, but I got it, and I could manage him in a way that was, I would call non-obtrusive in any way. No, I was not an advisor to him. I was not his political consultant. I was a young man serving what really ended up being a very important mission of keeping him on track. And now today, in today's world, they call that a body man. My job over time shifted, and I assume we'll be talking a little about that in the interview. But at the outset here, to answer I'm rambling and I apologize, but the main thing was the intuitiveness that I was gifted with of how to manage him.
Would you say that he was equal parts demanding and forgiving, or more the latter or the former?
More the former. I mean, it wasn't that he was demanding, just working for him created the demand. I mean, he didn't have to do that. I mean, I'm there to serve. He's not demanding anything. In fact, if anything, I would put him on the gentle side of managing people. He is not a good, he was not a good confronter. If something went wrong or something, I would most likely hear about it from Rosemary Woods, or, from later from Bob Haldeman or from John Mitchell, the campaign manager. And Nixon was not direct in criticizing or so forth. And so with me, he was always respectful to a young man, and there was no hassle.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today is former aide to President Richard Nixon, Dwight Chapin, who's the author of a brand new book, came out this year. It's absolutely terrific. It's called The President's Man. Mr. Chapin, as you were going into the 1968 election, were you more worried as a team about the primary against Rockefeller and Romney and others, or were you more worried about who you were going to face in November?
We were more worried at the outset about the primaries because Nixon had lost to Kennedy, Nixon had lost to Pat Brown, and Nixon had a phrase was coined, the new Nixon, but right below the new Nixon was Nixon as a loser. And if we lost any primary at all, that loser thing was going to pop up and take over anything to do with a new Nixon. So it was imperative that we win everything all the way through. The other point I would make is that we couldn't do anything about the opposition. The opposition was going to be whoever it ended up being, but we could do something about our own primaries.
When Robert Kennedy was assassinated, we actually had on the Leaders and Legends podcast a fellow named Mike Riley, who's now left us, but he was RFK's campaign manager in 1968 here in Indiana when Kennedy won the Indiana primary. I asked him in our interview, did he think that Kennedy could have beaten or would have beaten Nixon? And of course, he resoundingly said, yes, of course, absolutely. We thought that he was going to be president. Did you all consider Robert Kennedy your biggest obstacle or your biggest, especially after Lyndon Johnson, I think it's March of 1968, decides tells the world he's not going to run. But was RFK your biggest worry?
RFK was a worry. The Kennedys were always a worry. Nixon was obviously had his antenna up on anything involving the Kennedys. But you got to keep in mind, Robert Kennedy was much, much further left than Jack Kennedy. And we had this, the Vietnam War situation, the demonstrators and so forth were not cranked up to the extent that they became later on. Obviously, they were cranked up enough to have Lyndon Johnson not run for re-election. But but that whole movement was not as far along. I don't believe that Robert Kennedy would have beat Nixon.
Is the high point, and forgive me if I have my chronology wrong, but is the high point of the 68 campaign Richard Nixon on Laugh-In?
On the offense?
On Laugh-In, saying,
Laugh-In. That was
sock it to me.
That was very, very early on when it was the sock it to me. and that was Paul Keyes, who was the executive producer of Laugh-In, who was one of the world's great guys. He was very much a Nixon man and a great friend of President Nixon's, of the former vice president and the man that would become president. And Paul is one that arranged for that.
It's brilliant. You can actually look it up on YouTube. Do you remember your reaction when you saw it or heard he was going to do it?
Oh, I loved it. Well, of course, I loved Laugh-In. I mean, it was one of the great shows of all time, I thought.
The 1968 campaign, before we put you in the White House, the 1968 campaign was one of the closest in American history, one of the hardest fought. You had George Wallace as an independent. You had Hubert Humphrey as a sitting vice president who eventually breaks with his own administration over Vietnam policy. You have the bugging of Nixon's plane, the accusations that the Nixon or the Nixon campaign coordinated with the South Vietnamese. Hey, don't give in, fight, because when Nixon becomes president, you'll get a better deal. What are your memories of that campaign and some of the more nefarious charges against then candidate Nixon?
Yes, well, on the last one you just mentioned about the charges that Nixon somehow had encouraged the South Vietnamese the North Vietnamese not to work with the Johnson administration in terms of solving the war. That is just not true. And there has been a number of attempts by historians to prove this one way or the other. We were renovating the Nixon Library, and what we ended up doing, well, first of all, every document in the Nixon Library had to be approved by a panel of 4 historians that were picked by the National Archives, not by the Nixon Foundation, not by the media or anything, but by the independent historians. They came to the conclusion that this could not be proven one way or the other. And at the library, what we do is we present the information from the LBJ point of view, and we present the information from the Nixon point of view, and we let the visitor try to make up their own mind. And this issue continues to bubble up out there, but it can't be resolved because there does not exist, that has been found yet, any historical evidence that proves it one way or the other.
You find it somewhat ironic in that historians, and I think it's fair to say a significant portion of the news media, both disdain Nixon, but are endlessly, perpetually fascinated by him?
Well, this is an important point. In putting together the proposal for my book, The President's Man, and getting all this stuff together, the question was, would a publisher be interested in it? And I had 4 top publishing houses that were vying for my book. And books on other presidents, even a president as popular as Ronald Reagan, those books do not sell like Nixon books. There is something about the mystique of the man, his life. Maybe it's the fact that he had to resign office. Whatever. Nixon is of interest, and that continues to this day.
Do you think in part of it because he either affected or was involved or was a victim of big things, big events?
Yes, I that he ended up in the middle of big events, but I think that we're going to learn over time, and it goes right back to part of your opening coming into this show. Nixon was one of the most brilliant presidents that we have ever had. People do not understand his mental capacity and his sense of vision. I was listening to something last week about wisdom, and wisdom, a person that is wise or has wisdom is a knower. And Nixon was a knower. He could anticipate what was happening. Let me give you a key example. In 1972, he said in 50 years, this was in regards to China, in 50 years, we are going to be adversaries with China, and we have to be able to talk to one another. So that was said 50 years ago. And Nixon is saying in 50 years. I mean, it's kind of like the guy had a sense of history and of, I use the word proportion, but he understood events and the relationship of events to human nature and to a sense of a strategic necessity for the nation. And we just don't have that kind of thinking right now. One other real quick point. I had the great fortune of spending 2 hours at breakfast last Thursday morning with Dr. Kissinger. He was out in California. He's got a brand new book out. I had ridden with him, just the two of us, from the hotel over to the Nixon Library the day before. We had a chance to talk. He invited me to breakfast on the next morning. For 2 hours, I sit there and I listened to him talking to me about our trip to China. I had gone to China with Kissinger in October of 1971. And then I went back with Al Haig in 1972 in January. And then I went with the president and Kissinger in February of 1972. So I had a lot of China exposure with Henry Kissinger and so forth. And Henry is sitting there talking to me about Richard Nixon and how extraordinary a man he was. And I think that this is going to come through in the years ahead as we get past a lot of the Watergate stuff and start focusing more on the overall man himself and what he did for America.
I want to ask you about Secretary Kissinger here in a few minutes, but we're here with former Nixon aide, or President Nixon aide, Dwight Chapin. Was going to work at the White House after Nixon's victory in '68 a tough decision? Your wife, young kids. I mean, it's long hours, a lot of responsibility. Is it thought, well, maybe you should do something else and make a little money, but just couldn't turn it down?
It was a non-decision. There was no decision. It was the only game in town. Are you kidding me? I mean, we were so excited we could hardly stand it. I remember the transition government, so was at the Pierre Hotel in New York City, and the main question in my mind was, will I or will I not be able to be going to Washington? And that was answered very quickly that I would be going. And then in my own mind was, what am I going to be doing? And I was made his appointment secretary, and I was in charge of his schedule and everything around the schedule, including the use of our advanced men and the television office. So I had a portfolio of activities that I was given. I was 27 years old, so I'm a very young man with a a huge responsibility and having absolutely no idea of how to serve in the government of the United States. So it was a real steep learning curve. I'll tell you, we worked night and day.
Let me throw some names out to you, and you can just give me some off the cuff sort of comments or reflections. Let's start with Kissinger. I remember I've read several books about him, meaning Kissinger, the relationship between the two of them. A really good one I remember is called 1973, but there were a lot of really strong foreign policy books about them. It was 1988, and there was this televised debate on the firing line, and it was William F. Buckley and Kissinger and Jack Kemp and Gene Kirkpatrick against Paul Warnke, Gary Hart, and Pat Schroeder and George McGovern.
Ooh.
And moderated by Michael Kinsley. And at one point, I think it was Paul Warnke, a longtime defense negotiator and scholar, tells Henry Kissinger, basically, quote, Henry, when you were in charge of foreign policy, and then Kissinger interrupts and goes, President Nixon was in charge. I thought that was an interesting moment, that even 15, 14 years later, Kissinger was like, no, President Nixon was in charge. What was it like to see the two of them work together?
Well, first of all, that's an incredible story and a great story. And I mentioned Henry earlier, and the fact that last week he was saluting President Nixon. And I look at it this way, that Nixon was kind of like the architect and Kissinger and so Nixon had this vision, and he would create, not that Henry didn't contribute to that, because he certainly did, but it was Kissinger that Nixon put onto the shuttle that went off back and forth to Paris or to Beijing or wherever it is that they were trying to put some policy stuff together. The men, it was a subservient relationship. They were not co-equals by any stretch of the imagination. And you've got to remember now, Henry, this is Henry when he is first starting out in government. This is not the Henry Kissinger you know now. The statesman, the Henry Kissinger you know now, is a much more anchored, much more self-assured, much more distinguished, whatever person than that young Henry Kissinger back at the start of the Nixon administration. Henry had insecurities, and there were 3 or 4 different times that Henry got upset and was going to resign. And I joke today that Henry Kissinger we know today would not be the world statesman he is if it weren't for Bob Haldeman, who convinced him every time he wanted to resign to stick around. Had he not stuck around, he wouldn't have become the man that he is.
And one of the things that comes through in your book about your relationship with Kissinger is that it immediately became warm and friendly and close, and that for whatever reason, the two of you just kind of clicked.
We did. It kind of started in the first call he got to come over and meet with the president-elect was my call to him saying, Dr. Kissinger, President-elect Nixon would like to meet with you. And it started there right at the outset of his association with Nixon. And at the time, we went into the White House. My office was right. I mean, you literally went through a door in the wall there that went right into the Oval Office. So Henry would go in and out that way, and he would almost always stop, and we would chat a few minutes and so forth. So his first recollections of me and so forth are my being right there where you're going, going in and out. and it was off of that little just kind of the brief meetings and so forth that this relationship got established. And then the clock moves ahead, and they're trying to figure out who's going to go with Kissinger to China. And John Ehrlichman, who was much senior to me, he was a assistant to the president, and I was at that juncture a special assistant. So I was basically 2 levels down. John Ehrlichman wanted to lead the trip to China, and Kissinger didn't want Ehrlichman to do that because Ehrlichman had more seniority and might get in the way of, again, this plays to Henry's insecurity, might get in the way of Henry in terms of his relationship with the president. The other choice besides Ehrlichman, Haldeman says, what about Dwight? And of course, I was, again, further down the ladder in terms of the positioning within the West Wing, and was absolutely no threat to Henry whatsoever. And so plus I respect him greatly. So we had the uniqueness of our combination worked to my advantage when it came to the China trip. And I was responsible for all of the logistics, the arrangements. Henry ran the substance of the communique and the official meetings, and I was responsible for the rest of the party and the trip.
Your mentor in a lot of ways. What comes through in your book about your relationship with H.R. Haldeman was that he could be extremely hot. By that I mean friendly and supportive and pat you on the back, but then be bitterly cutting and critical. Why do you think he was those things, and how did you handle it?
Well, we found out later in life that I am highly dyslexic, and my wiring is just different. Bob was a very hands-on manager. He was a member of Mensa, highly intelligent human being. He expected a performance standard from me that maybe I could have met if my wiring had been a little bit different. But his expectations and his criteria were that we worked for the President of the United States, and everything, I mean everything, was to be done at the highest quality of work that could be done. So basically, excellence is conformance to requirement with no mistakes. And he wanted excellence. And I'm this young staffer, and I'm paddling as fast as I can. And so I think that was a huge factor in it, that my ability to deliver was a little bit different because of just basically how I was made up. I was not a managerial person. I was a much more creative person. And Bob moved me into game planning and to working the president's schedule in a much more creative way. The schedule can be worked where it's just a routine type thing, where you're scheduling meetings and so forth, or you can start innovating and you can start saying, how are we going to use the schedule to demonstrate certain things about the administration and our policies and so forth. And I, thanks to him, got the upward momentum to the game planning side of things, and that changed the whole nature of our relationship.
John Ehrlichman, who was basically the domestic policy advisor, did you have much interaction with him? Lots
of interaction. He was a wonderful man. He he was not in the pressure cooker part of the White House operation that Haldeman was. I mean, Haldeman is spending hours a day with Nixon. And so when he comes out of there, I mean, it's like there is no time for banter or, fellowship. Whereas with Ehrlichman's got a much looser schedule, time to sit and talk, and personality-wise, John was just a different kind of human being than Bob.
One of the very first people to join the Nixon for presidency campaign in 1968, Nixon for president, before it perhaps was even named that, was Patrick Buchanan. What was it like working with him, and was he truly the House conservative?
Yes, he was the House conservative. I introduced Pat at the Nixon's 100th birthday. We had a celebration at the Mayflower Hotel, and I put together this introduction, and I had a series of "Get me Buchanan. Where's Buchanan? Bring Buchanan in here." I mean, Nixon loved Pat Buchanan. Pat's mind was so freewheeling, and Pat represented the conservative side of the House so well, and Nixon just loved him.
And I remember a portion of, actually, I've watched that speech that Buchanan gives at that
Mayflower
anniversary. Yes, actually, absolutely right.
A terrific speech, and he was not well that night either. I mean, and he did a great job.
That I think he had a meeting with some of the more conservative folks that were part of the Republican or / conservative coalition, and they asked if he was Nixon's ambassador to them or if he was their ambassador to Nixon. And Buchanan replied, "I am the president's man always," or "I'm Nixon's man always." Gives you a sense of loyalty that Buchanan had all the way through.
Yes, all the way through. Pat is loyal to this day, and I think I treat him quite kindly in my book, and I treat him kindly in life because I absolutely love him. And his wife Shelley, who she was with us at the in the law firm. In our office, it was Rosemary Woods, Nixon's secretary, Pat Buchanan, and myself. And sitting out front at the desk in front of our office was Shelley Scarney, who later became Mrs. Pat Buchanan.
Now, the last few years have seen some interesting interactions between the White House press corps and the White House press office. But I have to say that even though he did not go to prison or jail, I find Ron Ziegler the most sympathetic of all the Nixon staffers. Am I wrong in that? And how hard of a job did he have?
He had a horrible job. Ron and I go back to the Sigma Chi house at USC. And then he worked at J. Walter Thompson as Bob Haldeman's assistant when I first started there. And then he came onto the campaign in 1968. Nixon won. Ron became press secretary. Nixon didn't want to call him press secretary. He wanted to call him press assistant or something. Nixon didn't even want to have a press secretary because he didn't want. He was so upset with the press. He was trying to figure out how to, and Ron, who is responsible for servicing the media, and has to be sharp, day in, day out, know every issue. I mean, that man worked harder than, I think, harder than almost anybody in the White House. Now, everybody worked hard, but Ron was so challenged by this having to appear before the media every day and answer their questions. And to do that as a Nixon man, a Nixon spokesperson, made it even harder.
What did you think of the moment where Nixon shoves him towards the press corps? That was unfortunate, and just one of the
one of those horrible moments. I don't know. I've never spent much time thinking about it.
Do you know that if the president ever apologized to Ziegler?
I don't know.
I want to ask a question about Vietnam and then spend our last few minutes talking about Watergate, for which you were egregiously and ridiculously convicted, which comes through in your book. But Vietnam, before we get to the Watergate portion of your book, it just seems like that Vietnam is the rock, paper, and scissors hanging over the presidency, that Nixon's got to figure out a way to get the United States extricated from Vietnam. And does it prove, in your view, to be more difficult than President Nixon anticipated?
Well, it surely was difficult, and it was agony for him. I was talking this story I was telling you about, talking with Dr. Kissinger. I remembered the buzzer going off shortly. This was like we had been in the White House maybe for a couple of months, and there was a buzzer system, and he pushed the button, and I went into the Oval Office, and he was standing in front of the desk, and he had in his hand some letters on. There's a light green stationery that our presidents use. Only presidents can use this stationery. And he handed them to me, and he said, "Give these to Rose." And as I looked at him, there were these tears coming down the side of his face. And these were letters to some parents of young men that had been killed in Vietnam. And he had handwritten these letters. Nixon was a Quaker. He didn't believe in war. He wanted to get those boys home, but I believe it was made harder for him to do what he wanted to do because of the demonstrators and what he was up against on the domestic side here in the United States. But he and Dr. Kissinger worked their tails off. And when I hear somebody insinuate that Nixon kept the war going so that it would help him in the 1972 re-election campaign, it really frosts me, because I know how hard those men worked to try to get that war ended. And it was they did yeoman work. And he came in there were 580,000 troops in Vietnam. Johnson had taken it up to 500. When Nixon left, and so there was, I believe the number was 12 or 16,000. He had taken it down to, and the war was basically over at that point. So he did get accomplished what he needed to get accomplished. It took him longer than he had wanted, and it was a cloud that hung over the whole administration.
What did you think of the movie Nixon, starring Anthony Hopkins?
Very honestly, I don't remember it that well. So I remember I went to see it, but I don't remember what my impression was, other than Hopkins did a hell of a job acting.
What are your memories of, and you detail this in your book, when President Nixon in the middle of the night decided to visit the Lincoln Memorial and talk to the protesters, the college kids? Is that, in your mind, does that like make you go, okay, that's something Richard Nixon would do, or I can't believe Richard Nixon did that?
No, that's something that Richard Nixon would do. The unexpected, the spur of the moment, he goes off and he does it. You know, they refer, there's an expression now, a Nixon going to China moment. Yeah.
I mean, the metaphor. Yeah,
the metaphor. And that's kind of like would fall into the same category. So I would put it there. He obviously couldn't sleep. All these demonstrators were coming to town. He's in the sitting room. Manolo, his trusted valet, comes in. He starts talking to Manolo and decides he's going to go out there and go over to the Lincoln Memorial and take Manolo to the Hill to look at the Congress. I mean, it was such a strange moment in history. But that if you really read those pages in my book, you can see, you can get a good feel for the inner side of Richard Nixon. He had within him, he wanted to be able to communicate to these kids that were out there demonstrating. He wanted them not to be disappointed in America, but to understand what he was having to do and why he was having to do it. And but he didn't want them to lose a sense of patriotism, of knowing that America was a good country, that we are good people, and that this war is not demonstrable of an evilness on our part. So it's a very telling memorandum.
When you first heard about the opening to China, what did you think?
Wow, I thought, this was not to be believed. I was with him at the NBC studios in Burbank, California, when he announced it to the nation. I did not know until I actually heard him say it on television. Very few people knew. Ron Ziegler, who you mentioned, knew. Bob Haldeman, Kissinger, Al Haig. But it was really a very, very tight group of people that knew ahead of time. And of course, then the media, it had just exploded. It was nobody could believe this. Nixon's going to China. And then the trip itself, of course, was incredibly historic. And Nixon coined the phrase, the week that changed the world.
During the visit to China, Dwight Chapin got this following compliment from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, who was so impressed with Dwight's skill at detail work and other things that he singled him out, quote, saying of Dwight, "You are an example of how we should utilize young men in government." How did that feel?
Well, he said that I don't think I was around when he said that, but it's obviously he did say it, and it's in the literature of the times. Zhou Enlai and Mao, you're talking about very ruthless men here. They
absolutely
responsible for killing millions of people. So, it's not like you put them on a pedestal of historic greats, but they are historic greats when it comes to the opening of China and the movement to that. I felt very comfortable with Zhou Enlai. I had dinner with him on 4 different occasions. Kissinger was always seated on the right-hand side of Premier Zhou, and I was on the left-hand side. But we would talk back and forth mainly about inconsequential things. He was incredibly interested in my education, and he came over and over again. In fact, my book seems so redundant because he asks me so many times about my age and my experience, and he just couldn't. He was trying to grasp it because in China, it was all old guys for the most part.
1972 is both the high watermark and the beginning of the end for Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration. You go to China, you go to the Soviet Union to sign the arms control treaty. But then in June of 72, several men break into the Democrat National Committee headquarters at the Watergate. When did you first hear of the Watergate break-in? And when did you first go, okay, this isn't a third-rate burglary, as Ron Ziegler said, this is something much significant?
Yes. Well, I first heard about it basically the night after Bob Haldeman had called me. I was at a party on the Eastern Shore, Maryland, and Bob called and said, do you know anything about a planned burglary of the Democratic headquarters. I said, what? And he said, do you know of any plans to go into the Democratic? I said, no, sir. And he said, you never heard Chuck Colson discuss this or anything? I said, no. So he had a concern, obviously, that maybe Colson had something to do with this. This was a very important phone call to me because it told, in retrospect, it told me that Haldeman had no idea of any break-in plans or any knowledge of what the hell was going on. So that's a good news part of it. The conversion from a third-rate burglary to this is more serious started coming as we got further into the campaign year. So this break-in happened in June, and I would say that it was maybe September, late August or September, when I had my first interviews with the FBI about this. So they sat down, and because I had hired Don Segretti, and because Segretti's name and phone number had been in one of the books that had been in an address book that had been in Howard Hunt's safe. And I explain all this in my book, but
it's a terrific accounting too. If you're a fan, if that's the right term, or a scholar, or interested in Watergate, Dwight Chapin's blow-by-blow account taking you through the months is really one of the best I've ever read. It's a terrific part of the book, which I know had to be painful at the same time.
Yes, Robert, but I appreciate your saying that, because I spend a lot of time trying to simplify this to the essence. And I've gotten a lot of compliments on my book about the way that we lay this out and explain it. But the answer to your question is that I started realizing when I was meeting with the FBI and so forth that this definitely wasn't a third-rate burglar.
Nixon famously won in 1972. I think he won 521-17 over George McGovern, an absolute thrashing,
Yes.
Which, again, you couldn't have predicted in 68 or 62 or 60. I remember watching George McGovern on the CNN show Crossfire. He was being interviewed by Pat Buchanan, and Buchanan asked him the question. This was probably 25, 30 years ago, but I remember it. Basically, Watergate had nothing to do with your defeat. You ran your own race and lost your own race. And McGovern very quickly said, I agree with that. That's true. McGovern even said that Watergate basically didn't matter when it came to the November elections. What are your thoughts?
I agree. It had no impact whatsoever on the outcome of the election, or the actual campaign itself. Let me mention this, that I don't know if you know this, that George McGovern, the last time I saw him was at President Nixon's funeral, and he was sobbing. He was sobbing. I mean, he was a warrior. He was Nixon. Nixon actually had a high regard for him, not in a political sense, but in a personal sense. He was a very good man, and obviously
a war hero. A war hero was a bombing mission in World War II.
McGovern, just the emotion of the Nixon funeral and so forth, brought up in him this reaction. I was surprised.
When H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman are let go in the early spring of 73, did that change everything for you from a perception standpoint of Watergate? Like, this has gone and grown way beyond anything that I thought it was going to be.
I had left in March. So I had gone over and started at United Airlines in Chicago. I was horrified that Bob was being let go, but but I understood the nature of that the president had to cut his losses. I mean, it was a dark day. Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman leaving, and that was kind of like, whoops, this thing is really, the wheels have coming completely off.
I'm going to guess, I don't know for sure, but I'm going to guess you have seen the movie The Caine Mutiny with Humphrey Bogart.
Yes.
And there's a famous scene at the end after Captain Queeg is convicted, and Fred McMurray, who was in the movie, who turns out to be quite the coward, and he has a drink thrown in his face by Jose Ferrer, the attorney for the officers who, quote unquote, proclaimed the mutiny against Humphrey Bogart, Captain Queeg. And Jose Ferrer says, as he throws the drink in Fred McMurray's face, "Here's to the real author of the Caine Mutiny." It's a very powerful scene. Is that what should happen to John Dean? Someone should throw a drink in his face and say, "You're the real author of Watergate and the downfall of the Nixon presidency." Metaphorically, that is.
Yes. Well, I just wish that the media would look at all of the facts and realize that this man did an incredible disservice to America. John Dean knew the day of the break-in, or the day following, when he first met with John Ehrlichman, and then later when he met with Bob Haldeman. John Dean knew the truth. And had he told his superiors exactly what had happened, there would have been no Watergate. Instead, he never tells Nixon the actual facts of Watergate for over 9 months. And it is in March of 1973. The break-in was in June of 72. It is March of 1973 when John Dean finally starts confessing the truth of what had happened. And then he's still trying to kind of disguise that. And as Nixon pushes and so forth, John Dean retains his criminal lawyer, and they go to the prosecutors, and John Dean starts turning on Nixon, and the rest is history. But John Dean knew, and he did not tell the truth to his superiors.
Is it fair to say that he is not held in high regard by other Nixon alumni?
Well, no, he's not, and rightly so, in my opinion.
Dwight Chapin eventually went to prison for 9 months for his, I'm going to say it this way, for his non-role in Watergate and everything that happened. It's clear from your book and other things that I've read that your sentence and your conviction is a horrid and terrible miscarriage of justice. But in your book, you seem to come to peace with it in some regard. Am I characterizing that correctly? And if so, how did you come to peace with it? Because I can only imagine the anger that one must feel if they are confined for 9 months for simply doing nothing wrong.
Well, Robert, this whole thing was a political shenanigan. The whole Watergate story, really, if you get into it, with all of the nuances of it, is a political story, not a criminal story. It serves the interest of some to make it a criminal story, but in my mind, it's not. And, you can go through life and carry grudges or be resentful. Somewhere along the way, I was taught that attitude determines altitude,
Mhm.
is a cute little saying, but it's true. So by kind of letting it go, by not being resentful, not realizing that it was a political thing and the prosecutors did their jobs. They were young men and they were making their careers off of the back of Richard Nixon. I don't agree. I don't like it, but I understand what they were doing. The Democrats wanted to, particularly a large segment of them were Kennedy Democrats. They wanted to reinvigorate Ted Kennedy and get him out of that Chappaquiddick mess. And that played into this drama. The media itself was took it and ran with it. Both Woodward and Bernstein became heroes, and investigative journalism, it's kind of like they won the marathon or something. I mean, it made them. I will say this. The other day I ran into Carl Bernstein at the author's night in East Hampton.
I was just getting ready to ask you if you'd ever met Woodward or Bernstein. Please go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I went. Carl and I have known each other for a few years, and we've had lunch and breakfast together. But I went up to him at this author's night at the East Hampton Library, and he gave me a big hug, and he said, "Dwight," he said, "I really enjoyed your book." He says, "I disagree with some of the content, but I liked your book, and I'm glad you did it." I said, "I bet you did disagree with some of the content." I mean, Carl Bernstein's position is that Nixon is an evil guy. Woodward has the same position, that Nixon is this evil, evil man. And the man I knew, the president that I describe in my book, is not an evil guy. Did he make some mistakes? You better believe it. But he wasn't an evil man. He was a historic public servant who honored America by his achievements and his work that he did on behalf of our nation. And sure, he made some mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes in life that he made was letting John Dean be his general counsel.
You mentioned President Nixon's funeral. I believe he died in early 1994.
Yes.
When was the last time you had a conversation with President Nixon?
Ooh, I haven't been asked that. I would say about a year before he died, maybe a year and a half. And over the years, there were any number of different reunions that he would come to. I remember going over to Saddle River, New Jersey, where his office was in later years, and having some conversations with him. It was I received letters from him periodically. I'll say this, that one of the letters that pops into my head immediately is that I was in prison. And it was February of 1976. And all of a sudden, this handwritten letter came from Richard Nixon. And he was getting ready to go to China. So we had gone together in February of 72. This is 4 years later. And he's getting ready to go. And he said, basically, the letter was, "Dwight, I'm getting ready to go to China. And I want you to know I'm thinking of you and our historic trip of 4 years ago." So I know that he was affected by what happened to me. He did say to me at one point, I took my wife, Susie, and our two daughters, and we went to San Clemente. We met with the president, and he obviously he had prepared saying this, but he looked at both of my little girls. They were, I would say at this time, like 12 and 10. Mm-hmm. He said something along the lines of, "I want you to know your dad did great things for the nation," or something. Mm-hmm. So in his way, he did his best to, acknowledge my contribution And I've always been deeply appreciative of that. But most importantly, I've been appreciative of the fact that he gave this young man, me, the privilege of serving. And even for all that went wrong, Robert, I gained so much more than I ever lost. It was a world-class experience, and I'm forever grateful.
Do you agree with President Gerald Ford's decision to pardon President Nixon?
Absolutely. What was to be gained? That Nixon's punishment was in resigning. People ask me, well, how do you feel about the fact that you had to go to prison and Nixon didn't? I said, how do you know Nixon didn't live in his own prison? I mean, come on.
Yeah, there's that famous video where he's at, I think, in Oxford at the student union, and he's trying to give a speech and to some students, and there are a bunch of people outside jeering him and insulting him. And he actually acknowledges their presence. He's like, this is what I deserve. This is what I get. So I thought that was kind of an acknowledgement of his own personal imprisonment.
Yes. And there at the neighbor in Yorba Linda, we have a quote from when he was interviewed by David Frost. And he apologizes and he says that the thing that troubles him most is, the idea that there would be cynicism among the young people in the country about serving in government and so forth. And the thing that I love, Robert, is that there's this quote. And then if you turn 180 degrees and look back on a wall, there's a Newsweek magazine cover. And at the top, it says, he's back.
He's back. That's right.
And when I'm taking people through the library, I always show them that quote that Nixon says. And then I turn around and have them turn around and look and say, had he not admitted to his faults and what he had done, that headline would have never been written. He's back.
The last question I want to ask you, and I'll ask very quickly, you've been very, very kind with your time. What was your reaction when you found out about the existence of the taping system in the White House and other places?
Yes, that was during the Watergate hearings, and Alex Butterfield testified that there was the taping mechanism. I had no idea and that it even existed. It was never part of my duties or responsibilities to have anything to do with it. And I was horrified that the tapes were there. I felt like Pat Buchanan. I felt that they should be burnt. I think John Connally too. I mean, let's build a bonfire and build it real quick. But that was not to be.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. We'll ask them very quickly for Dwight Chapin. Question number 1, what was your first job?
My first job was working in a car dealership, cleaning up the shop room floor with sawdust and a broom and making sure it was clean for all of the mechanics that came in.
Question number 2, what was your first concert?
My first concert, one of the best concerts ever, Neil Diamond in the Greek Theater in Hollywood, California.
Question number 3, if you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you choose? And if you want to give us a specific Nixon book that you like best, please do so.
There was an author, Woke, and he wrote The Winds of War.
Yeah, Herman Woke.
Great books of all time. And as for a Nixon book, I really recommend his memoirs, probably one of the greatest presidential memoirs ever written and highly saluted by publishers from all the publishing houses.
And this is an interesting question to you because you have been witness to so many great events. But if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Wow, what a question. Maybe Armistice Day, World War II. the end of a world war. What an occasion.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to discuss anything you want, whom would you choose?
Well, I just spent 2 hours with Dr. Kissinger, so I'll take him off that list. But I think I might be inclined to want to sit and talk with Rand Paul. I think he is such a thoughtful man, and he knows things I'd like to know.
Our libertarian podcast engineer, Chris Spangle, is jumping up and down at that answer for sure. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been White House aide to President Richard Nixon and author of a simply magnificent book called The President's Man, the Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. Mr. Dwight Chapin, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute joy.
Thanks, Robert. It sure has been for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.